Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, February 8th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 6 and our 30th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and the chairman of the committee. I'm turning the webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity once again to be with you and our other participants. We are continuing, as you said, our series of discussions on this extremely important topic. I would comment to any viewer who may not have been following our series that you will benefit quite substantially if you have the printed document or perhaps the computer document available as you are watching us discuss. In order to download it, you would go to the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, and there are two documents that you would be interested in: the text of Revelation Revealed itself and the companion essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that I wrote last June. These two essays are both available on the website. The website citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Since you will not be able to ask us any question while we are talking, we offer you the opportunity of sending in a question or two via an email message. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address that is identified at the bottom of that same homepage, namely info@globalendeavor.net. I should explain that in all these cases, the word global endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. So now we are ready to begin our substantive discussion on the webinar on the 1st of February, last Saturday. We essentially completed discussing page 7 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and we will resume there. I have one idea that I would like to discuss with all of you before we proceed on to the top of page 8. And this idea pertains to the unity of the various manifestations and persons of deity in their ministry to all of us and to the universe of universes. And for this purpose, I would like to go back to one paragraph of a segment about the work of the guardian seraphim that we read last week. This is the first excerpt of a separate document that I sent to participants last night. And for convenience, I would ask Bob to share the screen with us and put that document on the screen now, please. Bob, you're muted.
Neil, this is the document that has the 4 rows in blue.
Yes.
Okay, let's do that.
Please go up to, yes, thank you. That's the first quotation that I do want to focus on. George, would you read that paragraph for us, please?
Sure.
Number 1.
Sure. Ministering personality, the guardian seraphim, the God presence of the indwelling adjuster, the encircuited action of the Holy Spirit, and the Son consciousness of the Spirit of Truth are all divinely correlated into a meaningful unity of spiritual ministry in and to a mortal personality. Though hailing from different sources and different levels, these celestial influences are all integrated in the enveloping and evolving presence of the Supreme Being. Paper 113, Section 4, Paragraph 6.
Thank you, George. Bob, you can now remove this, if you would, please. Now, yes, last week when we talked about this paragraph, we were considering it as part of a longer discussion of the role of the guardian seraphim. That, in turn, was closely associated with the role of God the Spirit because I was making the point that it is not just God, excuse me, that it is not just God the Father who influences us, that human beings tend to overemphasize the role of God the Father, and that it is important to continue to be well aware of the role of God the Spirit. Today, I would like to look at the other element that we did not discuss that is mentioned in that paragraph, and this is the Spirit of truth. So the phrase in specific terms, it says the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth. Stephen, what do you take from that phrase, the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth?
Well, I'd have to say that it connotes that the Spirit of truth is sourced in the eternal Son and in our Creator Son, Michael, and that the Spirit of truth is a form of consciousness that's particular to that second person of the Trinity, and then through the Creator Son. I just wonder if the Spirit of truth is like a guide, or is it almost like a magnetic field that somehow influences our general awareness, that pulls us in certain directions or somehow leads us in certain directions. I mean, I'm just wondering about the kind of the mechanics of that spirit, how it actually functions in the brain or in the mind, and how that would connect with, the thought adjuster. I'm sure it's got some connection. It doesn't really, let me see, well, yeah, it does. It does mention the indwelling adjuster. So, which is the encircuited, well, it mentions the thought adjuster, which is the Father, the encircuited action of the Holy Spirit, which is the eternal Spirit, ultimately, and Son consciousness, which is the second person. So they're all divinely correlated. So I'm really interested in that divine correlation, as I was talking about last week. I brought up the idea of providence and how that is reflected, or how it's talked about. I mean, in this one paragraph, they talk about divine correlation. They talk about meaningful unity. They talk about integration, and they talk about enveloping an evolving presence of the Supreme Being. So it's very fascinating, and I don't really think they go into any more great detail about the how of all these things are correlated, except to use general terms like providence and divine correlation. If anybody knows any more about that, I'd like to hear it.
Well, thank you for the invitation, but I would also commend you for giving us quite a menu and in effect doing a great deal of my role to highlight the different elements in this paragraph that do correlate with the different aspects of deity. That indeed was the reason that I brought this forward once again. And now for my own interpretation, and I stress this is simply personal, I think that there is a parallelism between the phrase about the encircuited action of the Holy Spirit and the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth. We understand that the Spirit of truth is actually administered by the creative Mother Spirit, Christ Michael's partner in the administration of our local universe. And so I would offer you as an hypothesis that probably deserves to be tested, at least interpreted in some way, that whatever is happening with the Spirit of truth by the direct ministry of the creative Mother Spirit is similar to whatever is happening likewise by the creative Mother Spirit in relation to her own circuit, the Holy Spirit. And that's about all I can do for you. I agree with you that somehow the phrase the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth pertains to the role of the second person of the Trinity and also to our Creator Son, Christ Michael, who was incarnated on earth as Jesus of Nazareth. Bob, has anything that Stephen said or that I said that triggered some reaction in you? Would you like to contribute?
Well, there's a couple of things about the Spirit of truth. We know that that it arrived at Pentecost, and there are some interesting religious rites that are based upon all of that. As a matter of fact, there's an entire religion called, or I should say, a theology called Pentecostalism that uses that as the theme, although they don't call it the Spirit of truth. I'm not aware of the knowledge of this idea called the Spirit of truth, but certainly it's there's a fairly extensive discussion in paper 194 about the Spirit of truth. One of the things that I find interesting, and I'm not exactly sure where this is, but the Spirit of truth acts as acts on the cultural aspects of what is happening in current society, and it brings truth to the current society. It sort of evolves with where mankind is at the moment. So over the 2,000 years or 2,020 years or so that it's been active on this planet, it's gone through a particular evolution in itself. Just like in the foreword where they say that God adjusts through the thought adjuster. It's probably why they call it the thought adjuster. The same concept, I think, works on the Spirit of truth, in that it's actually evolving with the spiritual growth and potentially the intellectual growth of the planet. So that's one aspect of the Spirit of truth that I found fairly interesting. There's quite a few interesting statements in here, but the fact that we now have this, and I like Steve's idea of field. I think the best analogy or the best metaphor for us to think about all these spiritual, the Holy Spirit, the adjunct mind spirits, and all of this consortium of spirits that are here to help us get drawn into finding the Father is the best way is to think of them as fields. What is a field? You can go anywhere in your car, and you can be moving at 60, 70 miles an hour, and you'll still get the same station on your Sirius XM radio, because the field that is delivered is an area, just as long as you're on that side of the planet, is where you will pick it up. I don't think we quite really totally understand how a field works, but that's the best analogy that I can come up with. And the Spirit of truth is another enveloping field, spiritual field, that provides the consciousness of not only the universal Father, but the Son Michael. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we're seeing such an explosion in Jesus. Since and it may be partially what's caused the religion about Jesus rather than of his message. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I would focus on the element of the Trinity that is implicit in this initial explanation. I should say the first sentence of the paragraph that George read, because the first phrase before the comma talks about the guardian seraphim. All right. The guardian seraphim comes from God the Spirit, ultimately via the creative Mother Spirit. The God presence of the indwelling adjuster. The adjuster comes from the Father. And then we come to the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth. Obviously, comes from the Son. So there is a Trinity implication in this. One would think, at least as an hypothesis, that the role of the Son in the bestowal plan, and in particular in the bestowal of Christ Michael on our planet as our dispensational Son, is part of the meaning of the Spirit of Truth, but that's simply an hypothesis that perhaps can be compared with other ideas. And the encirculated action of the Holy Spirit, obviously, is also a function of the third person. Now we go down later in the paragraph, and the author, the chief of seraphim, uses the phrase, a meaningful unity of spiritual ministry in and to a mortal personality. Now, to me, the idea of spiritual ministry here implies something or a collection of activities that are happening largely in the human mind. Is that what you would say, George, or how else do you interpret it?
I guess I have a slightly different view of it evolving, like everybody else's. What struck me about the sentence was the fact that the seraphim personalizes these three spiritual influences. So in paper 5, the divine counselor says, if we want to understand the personality of God, we first have to start with the idea of God, then we have to advance to the ideal of God, then we have to advance finally to the spirit consciousness of God. So in the context of our discussion here, you have three separate personal identities, if I could use that phrase, which are unified. When they are unified, that's the realization of the personality of the Father. So as I think about these things, it seems to me that a way to interpret this sentence that we've been discussing is that you referenced a meaningful unity is what the seraphim does. And I think, as I understand it, I think the seraphim actually takes these impersonal spirit influences and unifies them in such a way that we are able to personally experience them as a unity.
That's interesting. Thank you. I agree that there are many possible interpretations. You've certainly identified a very interesting one. Doreen, I would ask you now to comment however you wish, but perhaps to consider the relationship of the guardian seraphim to these other spiritual functions that are going on, the encirculated action of the Holy Spirit and the Son consciousness of the Spirit of Truth. We already discussed how the work of the guardian seraphim is in cooperation with the work of the adjuster. But what I would ask you to do now is to think about or postulate how the guardian seraphim is able to serve in effect as an interface or a coordinating function in relation to all these spiritual influences, more or less along the lines that George has postulated.
Well, what you all said is, part of what I had read as well. But it also said the Spirit of Truth works, this dual spirit liaison hovers over the world, seeking to teach truth and to spiritually enlighten the minds of men, to inspire the souls of the creatures of the ascending races, and to lead the peoples dwelling on the evolutionary planets ever towards the goal of their divine destiny. So I think Bob is right. There's that energy force, and of course, they work on the outside as the thought adjuster works on the inside of our minds. I've had so many experiences now. I could say I believe being led to the truth, seeing the truth. I can't isolate one aspect of God and say, well, that's it. But I know that it enlightened my mind, and that's what the Spirit of Truth is to do, is to bring the awareness of what is the aspect of truth coming from a spiritual source, from divine truth, not just the truth that, because what did they say, there's facts and then there's the truth, and truth has to be experienced and all that. So it's so much more, if you could differentiate beginning at the lower levels and working up to the divine truth, there's such different variations and aspects of understanding it. I only could relate to things when I kind of get a sense of it, and internally, I know, it's like, what you know. And when something is active, it brings you to what you need to know if you're searching and you're sincere. So I think that's one of the aspects that the spiritual forces open up to you. It's a gift like the rest of the stuff. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I would, in effect, offer an analogy. Last week in the webinar, many people use the idea of an analogy or analogical reasoning. To me, you, in effect, are explaining the idea of the meaningful unity of spiritual ministry in terms of the results as you perceive it, that all these forces, all these elements of ministry are combining together in ways that lead you forward, that lead to insights, that lead to understanding. Now I'll give you the analogy. It's a bit like a loaf of bread. The bread is bread, it's baked. You don't really have to worry about the flour or the salt or perhaps a little bit of milk that went into it. What you have is bread, and the bread is a meaningful unity. And so now I have succumbed to the advice of colleagues last week who preached the value of analogical reasoning. Does anyone wish to contribute to this discussion right now? Otherwise, we will suspend it and go on to page 8. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, just a real quick thought here. You brought up this idea of the Trinity, and of course, the truth, beauty, and goodness are the cosmic coordinates for us to be able to start to understand more and more of the Father. But I was also thinking about there's a part in the papers, and I'm not exactly sure I can find it right now, where it says that when Michael became the supreme sovereign of Lebanon, that certain aspects of supremacy were now coordinated on Urantia. So I'm thinking, and I think George brought this up, is that it, you followed up with the idea of this little paragraph is kind of intimating that we've now got a coordinated truth, beauty, and goodness, which drives us to try to begin to understand just what supremacy is. They really don't tell us exactly what are those aspects of supremacy that Jesus was able to bring forward with his life here on the planet. But thought I'd bring that up just as another piece to add to the puzzle here. Over.
Thank you, Bob. I would leap on this by identifying your comments as directly associated with the final phrase in the paragraph. These celestial influences are all integrated in the enveloping and evolving presence of the Supreme Being. So that indeed is at least a paraphrase of what you've just said. Let's go on now to page 8 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. I would say that we are now continuing on with the analysis of God's presence in terms of the other possibilities, the other aspects of deity that the divine counselor identifies in section 2 of the foreword and that I reproduced at the bottom of page 7. This paragraph shifts to some of the higher levels of identity, of activity, of the 7 aspects of deity, And I wonder if I could get Stephen to read that paragraph that begins, since the human mind is subject to.
I'm not sure.
This
The
is the
second,
top of page 8 in my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus.
I'm not there. You better get somebody else to do that.
All right, Bob, would you do the honors?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Since the human mind is subject to and limited by time and space, the fundamental characteristics of finite reality, we cannot form coherent concepts about the current roles of God the ultimate and God the absolute. On the other hand, we can and should understand that God the sevenfold is a collective term that includes the work of the Creator Sons and the Creative Mother Spirits, their active partners. In section 8 of the foreword, the Divine Counselor explains. Would you like me to
Thank you. I would like to continue on, but perhaps I can get a different volunteer. Are you available now, Stephen, or have you found the place? You're muted, I'm sorry.
I'm almost there, but I'm not there. So you better get somebody else.
Okay, well, we now hand off to George, if you don't mind, George, to read the quotation in the square inside the blue square, the 2 paragraphs, please. You're muted, George.
The grand universe is the threefold deity domain of the Trinity of Supremacy, God the sevenfold, and the Supreme Being. The Creator Sons and the deity association of God the sevenfold provide the mechanism whereby the mortal becomes immortal and the finite attains the embrace of the infinite. The Supreme Being provides the technique for the power personality mobilization, the divine synthesis of all these manifold transactions, thus enabling the finite to attain the absonite, and through other possible future actualizations to attempt the attainment of the ultimate. The Creator Sons and their associated divine ministers are participants in this supreme mobilization, but the Ancients of Days and the 7 Master Spirits are probably eternally fixed as permanent administrators in the grand universe. Forward, section 8,
Yes,
paragraphs 10 and 11.
thank you. There are many rich elements in these 2 paragraphs that George has just read. I would start with the observation that may require a bit of adjustment in our mutual understanding, that Christ Michael, the Paradise Creator Son for our local universe, who was personalized on Urantia in the form of Jesus of Nazareth, is part of this term, God the sevenfold. The Creator Sons are part of the association of God the sevenfold. So it is perfectly acceptable to refer to our Paradise Creator Son, Michael of Nebadon, as God. He's part of the association called God the sevenfold. Now, I wonder whether there are aspects of this that are a bit difficult to understand, because he is far from the only one. All the other Creator Sons of the various local universes in the grand universe are also part of the association called God the sevenfold. Is this paradoxical, or how can we adjust to this idea, Bob?
Oops, sorry, Neil, you're tossing this to me.
I am trying to.
Okay. Could you give me a little bit more about, give me some more context? I'm not sure I know exactly.
Well, I'll go from a slightly different direction, and maybe it will be easier for you to deal with, because it will be perhaps a simpler framework. The other aspects of deity correspond to a single individual, God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. God the sevenfold as a term and as a reality is a complex association of many spiritual beings. Now, what do you say about that?
Well, let's start with God the sevenfold and the concept, because when you first study the papers, it's sort of an abrupt concept to really put your arms around. Basically, the Trinity is the hard concept. But I think the best way to understand God the sevenfold is to kind of take the idea as to what it really is. And we almost have to go back to the papers in the Divine Council in the Foreword and paper 105. I think that's in Melchizedek, where they talk about how the I Am was always self-willed and had to split and created the seven absolutes of infinity, which then, the eternal Son, which is an infinite God the Spirit, the infinite Spirit, paradise, and the other three absolutes of potentiality. So we start with all of that, and Pavona is then created, which is perfection. That's part of the grand universe. Now, at that time in eternity, that philosophical, conceptual time in eternity, there was nothing in the grand universe in the finite part, and that's when finite, absolute, and absolute were always considered, and that's when the finite realm had to be developed. And the way that that's developed, and part of the reason for the Trinity is to understand duality and triality comes from unity. It's the only way to, I think, to understand what God the sevenfold is, because that's the creation part of the grand universe, and it's the imperfect creation part that's here, that's meant to establish perfecting those finite, imperfect creatures to be perfect. So that's the context by which I think is important to understand God the sevenfold. And yes, so I was going to just make a statement. There's two other things that are occurring here, and that is we've been taught, at least in the forward, that there's different forms of deity: static, associative, and creative. And the creative association of God the sevenfold began to function when the seven super universes were organized, and God the sevenfold is now a creative associative expansion of the paradise deities into time and space. And it's a method of contacting us, all these imperfect creatures. Now, I started out in saying it's sort of an abrupt type concept, but it's the part of the papers that are not well studied or are very difficult to try and take the expansion of what humanity has, at least Western society has, in a theological picture of Genesis, because it takes this whole idea of the I Am and establishes that unity into a diverse universe of universes. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I think that you have contributed quite a bit of the philosophic background for the concept of God the sevenfold as part of the development of the universe of universes, and also the development of the progression of human beings and ascendant human beings toward God. In looking at the excerpt that George read, I think it may be useful for me to supplement my own essay by pointing out that the phrase at the beginning of the second paragraph he read uses the preposition in. The Creator Sons in the deity association of God the sevenfold. This is not stating that the creator sons are God the sevenfold. To the contrary, a divine counselor explains at the beginning of section 8 of the foreword that the creator sons are only the first level of the 7 levels of God the sevenfold. And I will proceed to read the rest of them. 1, the paradise creator sons. 2, the ancients of days. 3, the 7 master spirits. 4, the supreme being. 5, God the Spirit. 6, God the Son. 7, God the Father. So God the sevenfold is a composite, not only of almost 1 million paradise creator sons, but all the other levels that succeed them in the remaining 6 parts, or the remaining 6 elements of God the sevenfold. Now, I suppose that this may be the most complicated portrayal of deity that we have in the Urantia book, although I will yield to anyone who can identify a more complicated portrayal. But the point that I started with is that this is a composite, not a single being. Stephen, have I said something that triggers a reaction on your part?
Yeah, first of all, could you tell me what document we're in and what page?
Well, I was elaborating from the forward, section 8, in what I
Okay.
just said. But what we are reading now is page 8 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. And that contains at the near the top, the quotation that George read, the 2 paragraphs from a later part of section 8 of the forward, namely paragraphs 10 and 11. So
Okay.
I guess at the moment we are partly in the forward and partly on that page of my document, which quotes from the forward.
Okay, I just wanted to know what page. Okay, I got it. Yeah, I was going to say that in classical Christian theology, they had to figure out things like the Trinity. And that was an idea that never really had to be dealt with before. And one thing they did was that they came up with a kind of logic that dealt with what they called the economic nature of the Trinity, or the economic aspect of the Trinity, and the ontological aspect of the Trinity. So the economic is how God interacts with the universe, how God functions in the universe. And the ontological would be how God is in and amongst himself, before and prior and outside of interaction with the rest of the universe. And those 2 things are obviously related. So the economic aspect of deity is functional. And I see the God the sevenfold as a more detailed explication of what the church fathers called the economic expression of the Trinity. And maybe that's helpful, just to think of it in logical categories. That helps to differentiate and associate the ontological or the existential. The Urantia book would call it ontological, it would call it existential, and then the other term, the functional, would be economic.
Thank you. I think your word economical is interesting because it certainly is a very specialized usage that departs from the idea of the economy in material terms, but it does correspond to a kind of spiritual economy, which I believe is what you mean. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, another way of looking at this would be to see that the 7 levels of God the sevenfold, as described at the beginning of section 8 of the foreword, form a kind of ladder that allows human beings to ascend from our current status all the way to paradise, where we will be face to face finally with God the Father. And that the first level, the paradise creator sons, are the beginning step of this ladder for finite human beings to make that progression. Doreen, does that make sense to you? Do you see the creator sons as the first step of the ladder toward God?
But that's exactly what I had discovered. And it said, how could you know God unless you go through the different levels of force and energy and recognition of at least, the paradise, as you read, the creator sons first, and then the ancient of days, and to know, as you ascend. This whole thing was, I guess, laid out for us because we just could not go through to paradise without, how would you recognize God as in any level, even in the third source? You have to go from each level of not only the super universe, then Havona. And so he set up all these different personalities to help us. So they're all working in the grand universe. And I think it's a great, it's a great way to think out his plan because they're all involved in this work just to get us to where, we have to go. So, it talks about the supreme being and, is involved in this work and, all the God, the supreme in Havona, everything contributes to the next level. This is kind of, I guess, the synthesis or the combinations of reality for us. Everybody's working towards the same goal, all of them. And so he created so many levels. The almighty power is building up, it says, through all the work of the three groups who belong to God, the sevenfold, and that's the creator sons, the ancients of days, the seven master spirits. Then the supreme being is the immediate God of evolutionary creatures. He evolves just as we evolve. So this progression, this ladder is amazing. It's just, it really is. But it reminds me of something about a ladder. When I first got the Urantia book, over 30 years ago, not much more. And I had a dream just when I started reading it. And the dream opened up and I was in a room was totally white and there was these three beings. And I could not relate to any of it. And I thought to myself, and it was the funniest thing because I thought to myself, oh, this must be the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scouts, and the Girl Scouts, whatever it was, something relatable, that was familiar because I hadn't read much of the book at all. And then they showed me a ladder and I started to climb this ladder and I could only go to the third rung. And they said, that's it for you. And that was the end of the dream. It was so bizarre when I was reading, the book and come across the ascension plan and, how those coming down and helping us to come up again. It was, I don't know, it was so interesting because how would I ever understand this process, of personality and all the attributes of the Paradise Trinity? How would I ever know this if I didn't go through each of these levels to understand and experience it? And of course, we don't go alone, so that's pretty good.
Thank you, Doreen. I would ask George perhaps for a comment on the functions of God the Sevenfold that may not be personal, that perhaps correspond with the non-personal levels of the grand universe, for that matter, of the master universe. We are looking at this list of the 7 parts of God the Sevenfold in relation to our own progression toward God as individuals. But I suspect, frankly, that if one were to explain God the Sevenfold completely, it would also be possible to talk about the evolutionary management of the grand universe, and for that matter, of the master universe as part of the functions of God the Sevenfold. George, does that make sense to you?
To a certain degree.
All right, well, go ahead and tell us to what degree you like it or don't.
Well, no, I mean, it makes sense. In terms of your larger question, certainly the evolution of the supreme contributes to the evolution of the ultimate. But going back to the God the sevenfold, one way to understand it is in terms of what they tell us is that the Creator Sons, the Ancients of Days, and the Seven Master Spirits constitute the Almighty Supreme, acting in the seven super universes together. And the Supreme Being actually is located on the pilot world of the seventh circuit of Havona. And God the Supreme is constituted of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. So here you've got, this is what power personality synthesis means. The Spirit of God the Supreme and the power of the Almighty Supreme synthesize in the Supreme Being on the pilot world of the seventh circuit of Havona, which is, now this is easily related to the God the sevenfold in another way, which is that Jesus is the first level of deity that is comprehensible to us in the larger sense, both as a personality and also as a person. In other words, a being consisting of spirit, mind, and matter. At least he's comprehensible. He's comprehensible to us. The next level of God is the Ancients of Days, then the Seven Master Spirits, Supreme Being. So there's a progression in deity comprehension as you go up God the sevenfold. And that's exactly paralleled, that progression is exactly paralleled in the seven circuits of Havona. The same comprehension, progress and deity comprehension occurs from the seventh to the first circle of Havona, which is also exactly parallel to deity comprehension in the seven psychic circles, which we attain individually. So all of these things are related in my mind.
George, I agree with you. They are all related. And I would say to you that your comments, along with all the others, amount to the first time in my memory, the first time in my life that I've ever heard a coherent and thorough discussion of the concept of God the sevenfold. As several of you have commented, this is a very difficult idea that departs quite notably from the traditional theology of Western religion, although there are certain parallels. But I congratulate all of you and believe that we have done the best we can for the moment, and that the next step would be to ask Bob to restore to the screen that document consisting of 4 excerpts so that I can ask someone to read the second excerpt.
Neil, I'll do that in a second, but I do want to
All right, go ahead.
take you up on your challenge that to have someone find something that may be more complicated than studying God the sevenfold.
You're going to talk about the I am, I think.
No, I was going to bring up triunities and triodities.
All right.
You know, you have to go, back into existential 7 absolutes of infinity to really understand functional unity, which is what triunities are. And triodities, of course, are the are the non-spiritual things. One other quick thought with God the sevenfold. There is a parallel, and it's the sevenfold controllers. When George brought up God the Almighty, it made me think about that. And the sevenfold controllers map 1-to-1 to God the sevenfold. So if let me just take it up with the creator sons and creative spirits are mapped with the master physical controllers. The supreme being, obviously has both this physical and spiritual aspect, as well as a mindful aspect, the supreme mind. Ancients and days are mapped to the supreme power centers. The seven master spirits are mapped to the supreme power directors. This is an area that I'm not that well versed in. I'd like to be. The supreme being is mapped to the Almighty Supreme. The infinite spirit is mapped to the God of action, which is the infinite spirit again. But the eternal Son is mapped into the Isle of Paradise. So the seven, and of course, the universal Father is still the universal Father. So the sevenfold controllers are extremely important, and I think to understand God the sevenfold, we probably need to get into that discussion at some point. Just wanted to bring it up.
Thank you. I think in effect, your comments, at least in part, correlate with the inquiry that I was putting to George about the non-personal, non-deity aspects of God the sevenfold implied in the material realm and the administration of the universe of universes. But in effect, I believe you have justified my conclusion that we have gone as far as we can today, and that we would be better off to go to the second excerpt in the document that I circulated. I would explain before you put it on the screen that this second excerpt that we are now going to read just in a minute is related to the ideas of deism and theism that Bob talked about in a preceding webinar. The concept that God stands apart being the idea of deism, the concept of theism that God does everything there is. And in effect, the reality that the revelators have told us that it is a theistic universe, but God does not do everything that is done himself personally. So now, Bob, would you please put the collection of excerpts up on the screen again? Stephen, I've tried a couple times to get you to read something. Are you available at this point to read excerpt number 2?
Yes.
Thank you.
God is truly omnipotent, but he is not omnificent. He does not personally do all that is done. Omnipotence embraces the power potential of the Almighty Supreme and the Supreme Being, but the volitional acts of God the Supreme are not the personal doings of God the Infinite. To advocate the omnipotence of primal deity would be equal to disenfranchising well nigh a million creator sons of paradise, not to mention the innumerable hosts of various other orders of concurring creative assistants. There is but one uncaused cause in the whole universe. All other causes are derivatives of this one first great source and center. And none of this philosophy does any violence to the free willness of the myriads of the children of deity scattered through a vast universe.
Thank you. Bob, you can now remove the screen sharing. The phrase at the end of that second paragraph that Stephen read that attracted my attention for immediate discussion is the phrase, the first great source and center. Now, last week in our discussion, George, you commented that you look upon the personality of the Universal Father as the personal expression of the I am. And you commented that the idea of a first cause is seldom described or discussed as part of the general concept of deity. Does this add to your views on that point?
Yeah, I think my point was, my point relates back to my studies of personality as it's described in the Urantia book. So my ideas may not be entirely clear, but in my conception, personality, paper 112, they say, we can't define personality, but we can say that personality is devoid of identity. So that's confusing. We don't think of it that way. We conflate the two. They don't. They say we have a personal intellectual identity, a moral soul identity, and a spirit identity in the adjuster. So as this is my particular conception from my studies of personality, as it's described in the Urantia book. So in my conception, the I am is the absolute identity of the personality we call the universal Father. In other words, they're not identical. Personality is distinct from identity. So after having explained that, now you have to repeat your question.
I think you basically answered it. I would simply say that your explanation adds an additional layer of understanding to the idea of the first great source and center and the identity of the Father, the personality of the Father. And that in effect, the two paragraphs that Stephen read serve to establish that the Father does not do everything that is done. In other words, that there is a considerable difference between the concepts that the revelators have pursued and portrayed to us, compared with the rather traditional view that everything that happens on the street today is because God wills it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does clarify it. And by making this distinction between personality and identity of the I am, which they call the premier philosophic concept of the human mind, the I am, they equate with the concept of infinity of will. And they make a big distinction in any number of places between the infinite will of the I am and the infinite free will, the infinite creative free will of the universal Father. They're distinct. They're not identical. So the I am is a will of absolute unlimited power, but it's controlled by the free will of the personality of the universal Father.
Thank you. I will leave those factors for further consideration at some other moment. I would like now, though, instead to turn back to Bob, because Bob's, all right, you've asked for the floor anyway. I was going to turn to you, as I said. You mentioned the concepts in human thinking and human veneration of deity, of deism and theism in a previous webinar. And I said in introducing these two paragraphs that this contrasts very much with either of those two theories. Is that essentially what you want to talk about? And if not, I would ask you to add that reflection to your comments.
No, I'll certainly add the reflection. I wanted to just add something to what George said, which was extremely profound. I think that I'm going to have to play that one back, once I see this webinar again. But I had a paragraph that I was struggling with in preparation for this, because I was thinking about the I am quite a bit, and I'd like to read it because I think it provides a little support for what George said in a slightly different way, and it's in the foreword, section 3, paragraph 24, and it uses a word that I had to look up a couple of times to really understand it. It says the infinite is used to denote the fullness, the finality implied by the primacy of the first source and center. The theoretical I am is a creature philosophic extension of the infinity of will, but the infinite is an actual value level representing the eternity intention of the true infinity of the absolute and unfettered free will of the universal Father. This concept is sometimes designated the Father infinite. Now that word intention is spelled intension. The interesting thing about this paragraph that I wanted to bring out, and George pretty much explained it, is the I am is the philosophic extension of the infinity of will, which George brought up, but the eternity intention is pulling in of the true infinity of the Father infinite. These are really interesting concepts, and I think if we go back to God the sevenfold, where the I am differentiated because of the infinity of will, that the intention is the latter that you spoke about, Neil, and Doreen brought up so well in her description of this, trying to get to understand, the infinite. Well, we'll make a penetration of the sub-infinite. I'm sorry, we will make a sub-infinite penetration of the absolute eons ahead, of course. But that's what the goal is, and it's the intention to move inward to paradise, to make the extension of the infinity of will work out to the to finally understand and develop God the Absolute as an experiential deity. So that was what I wanted to add to George's. And yes, this paragraph is the is the epitome to me of why there was the paradox and why deism and theism became two sides of the same coin. I think that's how I described it last week. And there's some other parts in the that I think I have here that I'd like to talk about a little bit later, where because of this paradox, if this paradox is not resolved, and I think I kind of explained that as solving that paradox at another level. I have one more thought about that also, Neil. That both a deity, God creates everything, and of course he steps back and he just upholds the universe, although I'm not sure that's part of deism. And theism, there's levels of how God then puts his hand into things. So yeah, I think this is exactly what it is, and that's what omniscience is all about here. God doesn't do everything, as you said. I do have one other quick thought, if I could bring this up, because that sentence that we read that followed the one from last week that said that, where the divine counselor says it's impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize divine immanence with transcendence. Well, the interesting thing about when George brought up the next paragraph 2 webinars ago, and then we spent a lot of time talking about it, as I looked at this again, it's been kind of, very, because this is what the whole idea of deism and theism is all about. At the level of human logic and reasoning, the first sentence, the divine counselor says, it's well nigh impossible to try to resolve that paradox. But yet, the 2 essential concepts must be unified, but that's the faith grasp that has to be unified. And I think that's where the true teachings of Jesus are. I think Jesus was saying that you need to get to this faith grasp so that you'll be able to resolve these theological, religious paradoxes that are not going to be solved on an intellectual level. So the religions of the mind are completely circumscribed and will never be able to resolve those sorts of paradoxes, that being the biggest one, of course.
Thank you, Bob. I would have to tell you that from the perspective of the moderator of this discussion, you have given me 2 options for detours that could last half an hour or more, and I'm afraid I'm obliged to decline those 2 detours. Your citation of paragraph 24 in section 3 of the foreword includes vocabulary that is very complicated. We could easily spend a half an hour or more on that paragraph alone. And your comments about constructing the 2 sentences from the divine counselor's comments that we discussed last week and some partly the week before are also a topic that we could go into again. But I would like to return to the thesis that I was presenting and my main reason for asking that these 2 paragraphs be read, the 2 paragraphs that Stephen read from paper 118. It has to do with the relationship to everyday life that human beings perceive on God's part. Now, in recent years of my work as a translator, I have been exposed to translating informal comments from one Muslim believer to another Muslim believer that I will paraphrase at least by the following example. One Muslim believer says or writes to another Muslim believer, "We will discuss this at lunch tomorrow if God wills it." We will discuss this at lunch tomorrow if God wills it.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, yes. They use Allah, of course, as part of that statement. But without wishing to analyze the Muslim religion as a whole, I would say that this expression, if God wills it, involves an extreme idea of God's direct involvement in day-to-day events. The idea that God is going to dictate whether or not you have lunch and whether or not you discuss. I'm not sure that either of them exchanging those words really were thinking of this theology, but it does pertain to a direct involvement in day-to-day events that fortunately the revelators tell us is not accurate. Stephen, you asked to comment?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that what these Muslim believers were saying when they use the term inshallah, it denotes determinism in the sense that you were talking about it. I think it's much closer to, I guess, my favorite word these days, providence. And what George was saying really made me think about providence. In one of the quotes about providence, it talked about the law, the divine law. Now, law is thought to be deterministic. The law is the law, and that's what it is. But I think that providence somehow is able to incorporate ideas of freedom and determination in a way that we really can't quite comprehend. And when Bob was talking about intention and extension, and when George was talking about the infinite will of the I am and the free will of the Father, I think somehow all those ideas can be better comprehended, not fully comprehended, but better comprehended by thinking of what providence might be. Providence connotes freedom on the part of God and on the part of human beings, but it also somehow denotes determinism, that God's will is God's will, and there's not much we can do about that. And when a Muslim believer says inshallah, I don't think that he or she is saying God wills every single thing that happens in our life. I think the person is saying if providence permits it. And providence, again, is not deterministic. It incorporates the laws of the universe, which are God's laws, and the freedom in the universe, which is God's freedom. And somehow providence is an integration of those two. I'm not sure how, but I think it is.
Stephen, you've given a very plausible explanation, perhaps even convincing, although I'm not really schooled enough to be able to say that. I do believe, though, that there is a background to this wherein the belief that God engineers and pulls wires for everything that happens on Earth is one that we have gone away from, fortunately, with the teachings of the Urantia book. During the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865, both sides, North and South, prayed to the same God for God to give them victory on the battlefield. They had the religious concept that God was responsible for the outcome of that war. And in effect, what I'm saying to you is that this idea that God is directly involved in day-to-day events and makes decisions in regard to the outcomes is contrary to the teachings of the Urantia book. I would say also that the perception about miracles is at odds with the idea that God has created a universe in which there are natural laws, in which there is a respect for the differences of matter, mind, and spirit. And it also involves a direct wire pulling for day-to-day events that unfortunately is still around in human logic. That in effect, it amounts to the idea of omnipotence that the mighty messenger is in effect contradicting and protesting. Doreen, how do you look at the concept of miracles and the desire for a concrete sign of spiritual activity on God's part?
Oh my goodness. Anyway, okay, I'll try to answer that. Well, miracles. We don't know science, so we think everything that happens that we don't know is a miracle, and that's just evolutionary, thinking, and that's understandable. Somebody gets healed from a disease, oh, that's a miracle. God intervened. He's going to save you, but not the guy next bed to you. That's so, but that's okay. I think what was the second part of your question? I was going to say about God. He's so consistent and he's so reliable and he never does the undoable thing. And how do you relate to God? Because he's so consistent in everything he does. It is that one assurance that I could connect to as far as a human being that I can grow with, that is there for me all the time. So when I feel love in my heart, I know that love comes from God. And I'm not talking emotional love and that kind of thing. Is it agape or whatever they used to call it? But it's profound and it's a knowing and it's not explainable to say, well, what happens in a person's life I don't want to go off course. What was that second part of the question you asked? My mind just goes to whatever. I'm a female, as you know. Please repeat the second half.
Well, I certainly cannot dispute and would not wish to dispute the fact that you are a female. I recognize that. But I think you have, in effect, answered my question. It basically has to do with the concept that God is performing special acts to benefit his favorite people. And that's essentially what the idea of a miracle is.
Oh.
And it strikes me that not only is this contrary to the teachings of the Urantia book, but it is also contrary to an understanding of God as being even-handed and loving all his children, not just a favored few. George, may I turn to you in regard to the question of whether the predilection or desire for miracles in effect harkens back to the idea of the omnipotence of God, or is this too far afield for your taste?
No, it's not too far afield. In fact, superstition has always been a problem and has always infected religion. That's what we're told in the book, and I think we can see it for ourselves. On the other hand, the book makes a point of talking about two real miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and the raising of Lazarus. And those are things that even today we would have to consider miracles. So the idea of, yes, God does not, in other words, it goes back to what very good summary I thought, Stephen, you made about the concept of providence, which incorporates both will, call it law, the laws of the universe, spiritual and material laws of the universe, and the free will of God. In other words, God's not absolutely bound by the laws he creates, which is sort of the doctrine of deism. Deism is, okay, I created the universe, now you're on your own. I don't have to step in anymore because I created perfect laws. That was always the argument of the Cartesians and continental philosophers when, Newton, anyway, not getting into that. But so yes, as a general rule, miracles aren't always helpful, but there are special circumstances. Jesus went out of his way to raise Lazarus for the explicit purpose of persuading the Sanhedrin to take his teachings more seriously, to give them one last chance. So it's this sort of blanket dismissal of everything. There are no miracles, I think, overlooks not only those facts, but also the fact that the Spirit of God is actually communicating with us. You know, the divine counselor, I think it was in the first or second paper, says it's the mystery of mysteries. You know, nobody in the universe understands how it is possible for a thought adjuster to communicate with a material mind. It's just, so to him, that's a miracle. And so I think there's a certain danger in dismissing the idea that God can and does intervene both personally and socially, collectively, objectively in the universe.
George, I respect your analysis, and your points are valid. I think my question, at least the intent of my question, had to do with what you described as superstitions, and the very clear examples in which there was a special action for important purposes are not what I was referring to. The idea of miracles to cure people from this or that, whereby God directly intervenes to cure cancer and so on, has to do with the idea that God does everything and he's immediately available for handyman work around the house. I know what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying, but there is also this side of superstition that, in effect, the revelators, at least the mighty messenger who wrote that particular passage, are seeking to overcome by telling us that God is not omnipotent.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think there is certainly a common agreement of a middle ground here that you and I both share, and I appreciate the insights that you've given to us in regard to this. Stephen, you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, just briefly, when George used the word God intervening, that struck me. I think that thinking of God intervening in his universe is not the best way to express it. Again, sound like a broken record, but the idea of providence, I think, is a more sophisticated way of saying that God directly interacts with universe events and inhabitants of the universe. And it can't be an intervention. Intervention to me somehow connotes something from the outside interfering with something outside of it. So there's a separation there. The word intervening connotes a separation between God and the universe that I don't think is all that helpful. Again, the idea of providence, that God is within the universe, but not totally immanent in the universe. The word providence preserves what's called panentheism. Panentheism is not pantheism, and it's not deism. It's saying that God transcends the universe, yet God is in the universe. And if God is in the universe, he can't, strictly speaking, intervene somewhere where he already is. That might be nitpicking, but it just struck me as a little bit off to say that God intervenes in his own universe. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody.
Well, Stephen, I would say that there are nuances of definition here that probably are at the center of your remarks, and I believe it's best not to pursue these definitions in a very fine sense. We all speak with a fair amount of inexactitude, and I will now finally succumb to a temptation that has been afflicting me for the past 2 weeks and say that I thought that Providence was about 2/3 of the way between New York and Boston. So, Bob, you've asked to speak.
Yes, and I went to Providence College. That fascinating subject, fascinating discussion. I just wanted to quote from paper 118 about Providence, and I like Steve's idea that Providence has a dual approach here. It has some determinism and basically a just free will. That's kind of how I see the Supreme. We know God adjusts through the thought adjuster. And, as the divine counselor says it in the forward, I'm sorry, in paper 1. And we know that the discussion about the Supreme says that the Supreme is not just a passive recipient collecting all of the value experiences of personalities throughout the grand universe. We're taught that the Supreme is a maker of his own destiny at the same time. So there's a bidirectional aspect working here. And frankly, I've always felt that when the Supreme acts, that's what we're talking about providence. There's a whole section on providence that is a great read, and I think Steve has caught the essence of it here. There was one sentence I think that maybe supports that. Let me read this. It's from section 10, paragraph 11, paper 118. I'll read from the center of it. It says, "The providence of the over-control of supremacy becomes increasingly apparent as the successive parts of the universe progress in the attainment of finite destinies. As the systems, constellations, universes, and superuniverses become settled in light and life, the Supreme increasingly emerges as the meaningful correlator of all that is transpiring, while the ultimate gradually emerges as the transcendental unifier of all things." So providence becomes more of an actuality as perfecting becomes, as more perfection occurs throughout the 7 superuniverses, and of course each of the local universes in the planet. So just a little support on that. Back over.
Well, Bob, thank you once again. You have presented me with another dilemma, or if you prefer a paradox, you like that word better, because in effect, you've given me another opportunity to drive off into the field instead of continuing on down the road. And I'm afraid that I'm obliged to neglect that possibility because we should move on in this discussion. Doreen, I would like to turn to you now and ask you to look at the middle of page 8 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. And if you could read the paragraph for us that begins with the words, "We are already quite familiar."
Sure. We are already quite familiar with the role and responsibilities of our Paradise Creator's son, Michael of Nebadon, for he conducted his 7th and final bestowal in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth. Further, the active ministry of the Spirit of Truth is his presence and therefore the presence of God. During Jesus's farewell discourse after the Last Supper, the Apostle Thomas declared that the apostles would follow Jesus that very night if he would show them the way. In reply, Jesus declared, "Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man goes to the Father except through me. All who find the Father first find me." The Midway Commission, paper 183, section 3, paragraph 7. And it says in paper 182, the Midway Commission associates this reply to Thomas with many other statements of Jesus that are equally inspiring.
Thank you. I would like to promote discussion of this statement at the beginning of the quotation, whereby Jesus says, "Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life." How do you interpret that, George?
I interpret that in terms of personality of Jesus. He is a reflection. He is the best reflection we have of the personality of the universal Father. And by personality, I mean that reality which is different and distinct from the spirit, mind, and matter of the person of Jesus or Michael. So if we're in fact searching for the Father on paradise, if we're actually seeking to find him as a personality, Jesus is the first stepping stone.
Thank you. That is certainly a very interesting interpretation that I share by and large. Stephen, would you add to it?
Well, I take this to mean the difference between talking about Jesus and following Jesus. So, or preaching about the teachings of Jesus as opposed to living the teachings of Jesus. And I think that's what he was trying to get across. I think it probably went over everybody's head. And I think if any of us were there, it probably would have gone over our heads too. I mean, this is a very profound way to present that truth. And we have a little bit of separation, and we can see the words on the page and we can reflect on them. But I think this is a very deep teaching, and it is something that even we have to keep in mind, as I think Marvin was talking about, when we deal with the teachings of the Urantia book. Do we focus on talking about the teachings, or do we focus on being the teachings or living the teachings? I think there's a little bit of an analogy there as well.
Thank you. I agree with you. I agreed with George. Also, I would like to put a third element to Bob and ask whether this is a quite literal statement about the local universe of Nebadon, that we live in Christ Michael's local universe of Nebadon. We must go all the way through the progression within the local universe of Nebadon in order to graduate from it to higher levels of the super universe, that he is the way, and this way requires us to achieve all the purposes that he has established in his ladder of progression in his local universe of Nebadon. Does that make sense to you, Bob?
Yes, it does, Neil. I was going to actually say that. My picture of this statement, shows up in the Bible, and having heard of it in catechism and going through Catholic schools, without the cosmic perspective that I got from the Urantia papers, from paper 1 to paper 196, I would have never have known about the local universe or Michael the sovereign, or the sovereign ruler. And yes, I'm thinking of the grand universe educational system, the first of which we go to the mansion worlds and then progress to become citizens of Jerusalem. That's all Michael's domain and his creative consort. He came out. We're taught that he came out into an area that he staked out, as do all of the Michaels, the 700,000 of them, and works with not only the power controls and the power centers, etc., to understand how energy has to work in his. I can only imagine the effort it takes to correlate all that. And in fact, developed this pathway himself through the constellations, through the through the local universe, and that's exactly what I was thinking. It's great to have this cosmic picture, because that statement, now I am the way, the truth, and the life. Essentially, he assigns the life carriers on each of these planets, numbers the planets that are going to be inhabited, so on and so forth. So, with the cosmic picture that the papers provide, that statement means light years much more than what it was until before I found the papers. Over.
Thank you. I appreciate your confirmation. I think you and I see this from the same perspective, at least in these regards. I would ask you now, for the context that I believe you have inferred, that this statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life, has to do with the identity of Christ Michael, the Paradise Creator Son, Michael of Nebadon, not the human personality of Jesus of Nazareth. Am I correct in that? Or is
Yeah, I thought I inferred that. Yes, we're dealing with Christ Michael. We're not dealing with Jesus, and I don't think that I think Steve said that this probably went over the apostles' heads. Yeah, obviously, there just wasn't the context to be able to really understand what that meant. They should have gotten an analogic thought about it, though. I'm surprised they couldn't have done that by that time, but they didn't. And it took a couple thousand years for us to finally understand, what is a local universe, and what is a local universe sovereign, and what's a master Michael. Over.
Thank you. I would say, before I recognize George, that the discussion that I've been having with Bob does not extend through all the implications that he, George, and that he, Stephen, previously adverted to. It has to do with this very practical interpretation that Bob and I have been talking about. Go ahead, George, your turn.
Yes, no, I just wanted to bring up the point that Jesus and Michael are not different personalities. They're the exact same personality manifest as different beings. In other words, they make a very big point about telling us that Jesus and Michael are exactly the same personality. Exactly. So, I guess I have to disagree with what I thought I heard, which was that they're somehow different personalities. They're different identities of the same personality. That's my only point.
George, I think there's a large commonality in what you've said and what I said, but I believe perhaps that we might be benefited by going a further step. Jesus of Nazareth was the seventh bestowal identity of Michael of Nebadon in a series of 7, wherein he assumed the personal identities of 7 different beings in his local universe. And so Jesus of Nazareth now, as a reality, is part of the accumulated total identity of Michael of Nebadon. From my perspective, Jesus of Nazareth is not an independent spiritual person. Rather, he is a part of the spiritual identity of Christ Michael, the Paradise Creator Son. Now, if I said something that you don't quite agree with, if so,
Well,
please.
we may be arguing over terminology. As I understand it, again, they make a very big, large, emphatic point that there's one personality involved, only one. So that personality acquired experience as different identities during his 7 bestowal experiences, but he remained at every point, both before and after every bestowal, remained this exactly the same personality. So I was just responding to what I thought I heard. And like I said, I don't want to get into trivia, but the point to me seems extremely important, which is that to follow Jesus means to follow Michael which is to follow the personality that animated both.
George, thank you for going
Neil, let
at
me just
this.
follow up. Yes, I totally concur with George. It's a single personality, and I might have misspoken a little bit there, where I said, no, he wasn't really referring to Jesus, but I think he means Michael, which is the summation of all those bestowal identities. So yeah, totally concur, George. Right there with you.
I think we all agree that there is one being, one spiritual being, and the names perhaps get in our way. The point that I was trying to make is that Jesus of Nazareth, as a practical matter, is now part of the accumulated total identity of Michael of Nebadon, which includes the identities that he assumed during his preceding 6 bestowals. So we do not need to have an extensive discussion about terminology, but in effect, the phrase that we are discussing right at the moment, I am the way, the truth, and the life, has practical and concrete implications, those that Bob and I were talking about. It has theological and spiritual implications, those that Stephen and George were talking about, and I do not argue with any of those interpretations. Doreen, I see you smiling. Does that mean you want to say something?
Well, I thought that you were going to call on me eventually.
Well, I would if you put your hand up, but I will also call on you from time to time simply because I get tired of listening to all these men.
Oh, my flattery will get you no place. Listen, when what you said before, that's how I always understood it, that it was literally and figuratively. I think it's both, because he's going to leave the apostles. Remember, now they're worried. They want to know, what's the journey about? Where am I going? What's going to happen? So, and they want to know where he's going to lead them. So he's saying, if you have faith, I guess faith is the way. Trust in the shepherd. He said, truth will set you free. Jesus is the truth. He never failed them. So, it's the person's example and the model. He's giving them hope for the eternal future. It's more important, to give them that than what they're experiencing here. He's telling them they're all, I suppose, all infinite phases and powers and attributes that will probably be expressed perfectly where love exists. So I kind of understood to a point where, what did they know about the afterlife, except what he exampled, what he expressed to them? When he says, I am the vine, what does that mean? That was to me, learn to love one more person every day. Learn to love. You will, you will develop, grow fruits of the Spirit. But it was all about how they perceived him, how they trusted him. If you don't, he had such a self-assurance. He inspired hope, and he inspired confidence and in the hearts. And that's what he needed to do, to go when he left them, to, leave them with something that they could identify with, they could feel and trust, no matter, because they're going to give their lives up on the line. And they had to know for sure, that they were going to be with him afterwards. So he had to leave them with, I don't know, to me, it's like the truth, beauty, and goodness of where you're heading. Who would follow anybody otherwise? If I didn't try, I would never follow anybody until I felt that person lived that kind of life. That's what they exemplified. Everything that they're saying, I have no doubt, I truly trust them. That's the person that would resonate inside of me, that would, I would say, okay, that makes a lot of sense now, because you learn to love them. And loving him meant everything to them, everything.
Doreen, thank you very much. I appreciate the personal touch that you always provide to your comments. And I would say also the emotional resonance, the degree of love and kindness that are obviously evident in your remarks. George, now that Doreen has created a very favorable climate, at least from an intellectual and emotional perspective, I wonder if I could call on you to read the quotations that appear in the box, starting on the bottom of page 8, but also extending all the way to the top of page 9 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus.
Sure. Okay, from the box. The Master, during the course of this final prayer with his apostles, alluded to the fact that he had manifested the Father's name to the world. But when Jesus had finished his earth life, this name of the Father had been so revealed that the Master, who was the Father incarnate, could truly say, I am the bread of life. I am the living water. I am the light of the world. I am the desire of all ages. I am the open door to eternal salvation. I am the reality of endless life. I am the good shepherd. I am the pathway of infinite perfection. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the secret of eternal survival. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the infinite Father of my finite children. I am the true vine, you are the branches. I am the hope of all who know the living truth. I am the living bridge from one world to another. I am the living link between time and eternity. Paper 182, section 1, paragraph 9 through 25.
Thank you. Before opening the field for general comments, I would compare these statements with discussion that we undertook last week concerning the value of analogy and analogical reasoning. Many of these statements, although not every one, amounts to an analogy. The idea of open door, the idea of light, the idea of good shepherd, the idea of true vine, living bridge, living link, all amount to analogies. And so I think that the discussion we had about the value of analogies actually is not only confirmed, but perhaps even epitomized in these quotations that the Midwear Commission has assembled. Now, I'm at a loss to identify any one of these statements as being more meritorious than any of the others. I think they're all equally valid and all equally inspiring. And so I am going to give you carte blanche, Stephen, to comment on any aspect that you wish to address.
Okay. Well, why don't I just take the first two? I am the bread of life. I am the living water. He also says, I am the true vine. So I can link these statements to his institution or his instantiation of the Eucharist. And we are asked to remember him and resurrect him in a sense, spiritually speaking, in our lives by performing that symbolic action. And I think he's reinforcing in the minds of some anyway, that that single ritual that he left us, and he's saying that there is something we can do in our lives on a regular basis that would physically and personally and existentially, I mean existential in the human sense, that we can do on a regular basis to bring him into our lives. So that might be one of the meanings of his using those analogies.
Thank you. Again, there are so many options here that I cannot really gravitate toward any one or the other. Perhaps, Bob, you can choose other statements that complement the ones that Stephen just commented on.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. And, I have a favorite, of course, but I want to go back to the beginning of this, which is pretty interesting. I hadn't thought about this. Sometimes when you do these webinars, something hits you over the head that you hadn't thought about before. Well, this one did to me here. In his final prayer with the apostles, he alluded to the fact that he had manifested the Father's name to the world. That's the first one that caught me. And I actually highlighted this as I was taking a look at this before the webinar. But when he finished with his earth life, so this is after the resurrection, I should say after, after the death of Jesus, the name of the Father had been so revealed that the Master, who was the Father incarnate. I don't know if there's any other place where the Midwayers talk about the Master being the Father incarnate. And I think maybe that's the aspect that I brought up earlier, where there were certain aspects of supremacy. Jesus is the only person, the only human on the planet who has fulfilled all of that. And he perfected his life, is what they tell us. But I'm not sure I really understand the Father's name to the world. And I think it requires all of these statements here to maybe get a feel for all how these analogies are driving the Father's name. I'm not sure I quite understand why they're calling it the name, but the one that appeals to me are the two that appeal to me are the last two. I am the living bridge from one world to another. Certainly that's the case. That's a little bit more, I should say it's a little bit less analogous. It's more specific. And I'm the living link between time and eternity. That also. So I guess that's all I can say about these right now. It's a wonderful list.
Thank you. I would reply to you that bridge is certainly an analogy. We're not talking about crossing a river. So yes, they are conceptual, okay, but they are also partly concrete as an analogy. Now back up to your point about incarnate. It's interesting to wonder whether we could find that word again, but the explanation of the nature of the Paradise Creator Sons of the Order of Michael in the early papers indicates that the Michael sons of whom Christ Michael, our Paradise Creator Son, is fully representative, are the sons of the Father and the Eternal Son. So in a sense, that definition of the Paradise Michael sons establishes the Father incarnate by genealogy. Does that help you?
Good enough. I see the Midwayer's term of the name being, maybe the essence or the intention of the Father rather than name. I won't quibble with the words, but I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, Doreen, your turn for your favorite statements in this list.
I see it all interrelated. I don't see it as separate one from the other. I think it makes a statement of such enormous proportions of faith and love. And we have to do it together because the road ahead is going to be rough for them. And so, the treasure, remember the treasure of everything you have is inside of you. It's not outside. It's all in the hearts of these guys. He's leaving them with something profound, just to hold them steady so that when he goes, they will not fall apart. It's profound. When you're saying, I am, I mean, how do you interpret, as has said before, I am, God incarnate, or however you want to put it in their language at the time. I think that's profound. At that time, it's beyond what I could truly understand, looking, from a perspective of these apostles and Jesus. So I said, if it isn't through that sense of, all connected to one another through him, through the Father, to me, it's all interrelated. It's to give them that, maybe the ladder or the rope to get where they're going, to hold them, their feet on the ground, and continue with inspiration and love for one another, and understanding that it's not all for nothing. So I can't just say one without the other. I don't know. I'm sorry.
You don't need to be sorry. There's no reason to be regretful, because you've given us your perspective on this. And I think that I will now, in turning to George, paraphrase your perspective and offer him at least the option of analyzing all of these as alternative ways of representing the same reality. In a sense, the Midweir Commission here, in this particular series of statements, is adopting a technique that we note throughout the Urantia book of saying essentially the same idea in different ways from different perspectives, so that finally human beings can seize upon the idea. And perhaps, as the others of you have already demonstrated, pick out an explanation that is particularly meaningful or particularly congenial to you. But all of these explanations end up at the same destination, in my opinion. George?
Yeah, no, they all do. And I have to agree with Doreen. You can't pick out one as a favorite. Altogether, they add up. And this goes back to what Bob mentioned. Altogether, they add up to the equivalent of the name of God. And so that's, if you think of them all together, that's the name of God. So that's not a name like we know a name. That's a name, well, it's not a name like we know a name. But so if we want to put a label on it, but the only label I can think to put on it is that's the name of God. And you say, what's his name? Well, that's his name. But in terms of, I don't have a particular favorite, but the one that really jumps out at me, has always jumped out at me in this list, is where he says, I am the infinite father of my finite children. Now, I one point I considered, well, maybe he's speaking metaphorically, or maybe the Midwayers are speaking metaphorically. But just prior to giving this list, they say that he was the Father incarnate. So it's really an extraordinary statement that this human being standing on this planet says, I am the infinite Father of all of you. So I think what he's saying is that, at that moment in time, he was manifesting himself as the infinite Father, literally. Not in all of his infinity, but in the perfection of his personality.
Thank you, George. This is a very interesting point from the perspective of philosophy. We have obviously the level of the finite. The revelators tell us that in between the finite and the absolute is the absolute, a term that they have invented that frankly we really cannot explain. And then that the top level is infinite, which they sometimes associate with absolute. But since the Father is absolute and infinite, the Son of the Father, in this case, Christ Michael, who is also the Son of the Eternal Son, is absolute on levels that we cannot understand. And he has said in this statement that he is infinite too, therefore sharing the attributes of the Father in this regard. And perhaps we can consider that a paradox, or at least an element that is very difficult to understand. Stephen, you would like to talk?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in the in the Muslim religion, in Islam, they famously talk about the 99 names of God. And that is an analogical way of saying that there is no way you can describe God with one name, that God is outside of all names, and that God is inherently beyond our understanding. And that's where the number 99 comes. It has a kind of a association with it that means many and then many more than even 99. 99 is an indication that there's not just 99, there's an infinite number of names. And that brings God outside the realm of finite reason and finite logic, and is an analogical way of talking about the nature of God.
Thank you. You remind me of an impulse that I had immediately after hearing George give his most recent contribution. The focus on the word name also triggered for me the idea of personality and identity, but perhaps also role and function. I think, in effect, those concepts, name, identity, role, function, personality, are probably all involved in this idea of God's name. And it is simply a limitation of our language that we perhaps have difficulty grasping those inner associations of these various concepts. Yes, Doreen, please.
Oh, just briefly, I heard, Stephen, as well, in Judaism, I heard and read that there were 100 names for God. And also, I think they called him Hashem. And I think it's because you were forbidden to say the name of God. And that was like blasphemous. So it was interesting. I didn't know Islam did the same thing.
So by implication, if there are 100 names in Judaism and only 99 names in Islam, Judaism beats Islam by 100 to 99. Is that the point? All right, I see others are laughing. That was my intention. I would like, if we could, perhaps to go on to the next paragraph, but I do offer all of you the chance to contribute on these statements if there is something additional that one or more of you wishes to say. Bob?
Yeah, it was earlier I said there was something referring to after Jesus was put to death and Michael was now a sovereign, that had something to do with supremacy. And I would point everyone to confer with paper 119, and the section 8 is about Michael's post-apostolic status. I'll just read a quick sentence here about that. I think this might have been exactly what I was looking for, because it talks about the 7 bestowals that we were just referring to. It says that the completion of these 7 bestowals resulted in the liberation of Michael's supreme sovereignty, and also in the creation of the possibility for the sovereignty of the supreme in Nebadon. On none of Michael's bestowals did he reveal God the supreme, but the sum total of all 7 bestowals is a new Nebadon revelation of the supreme being. So it took this last one to really seal the verdict on that. There's much more in that section there that I would say confer, and maybe I'll just come up with something next week after I take a look at it a little bit more depth. But this was a pretty important bestowal, and they do mention in the next paragraph that, and your record tells the truth when it says that the same Jesus has promised sometime to return to the world of his terminal bestowal, the world of the cross. So it's a pretty important place, unique in all Nebadon, of course.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think this paragraph that you have just read contributes to the context that occurs later on page 9 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. And so I appreciate, in effect, your introduction to some of those ideas. But at the moment, I wonder if you could continue, Bob, by reading the paragraph in the middle of page 9 that starts with the phrase Christ Michael's partner.
Sure, thanks, Neil. Christ Michael's partner, the creative Mother Spirit, ministers to us on her own behalf as the Holy Spirit after she creates the practical framework for consciousness and choice via the unceasing efforts of the adjutant mind spirits. All in all, it seems quite reasonable to construe the complex ministry of the Mother Spirit as the presence of God, at least indirectly and by implication.
Thank you. I would first state that this paragraph amounts to a statement of my opinion and my interpretation. You certainly are not obliged to accept it. I think that it helps to look at these matters, the functions of the creative Mother Spirit, from that perspective, not quite putting her efforts on a parallel with the standing of the Paradise Creator Son, but realizing that she is his active partner. And so that just as he participates in the deity association called God the Sevenfold, so by implication does she. I wonder if that makes sense to you, George.
Yes, it does. You know, there is no personal spiritual experience without. You not only need the thought adjuster, you also have to actively engage the adjutants of worship and wisdom, which are, as I've come to think of them, manifestations of the Holy Spirit, as distinct from the other 5 adjutants, which are only associated with the animal intellect. So, yes, I essentially agree with what you've written.
Thank you, George. I would say that the consciousness that we have mind-o capabilities depends on understanding the role of the adjutant mind spirits that you, George, have just explained. In other words, we are not simply living artifacts such as a plant. We are not simply animals. And it is the role of the adjutant mind spirits that creates the framework of consciousness and choice, moral decisions, that makes us human. And the role of these 7 adjutant mind spirits combined together creates a framework in which it is possible for a thought adjuster to come to us and to be bestowed upon us. So the creative Mother Spirit is creating the framework that generates the possibility of spiritual growth and the possibility for the bestowal of the thought adjuster. Stephen, do you believe that this paragraph at least helps recognize her importance as a partner of Christ Michael, the Creator Son?
Yes. And I was struck by the description of the Mother Spirit as the presence of God. There is a term in in Judaism called the Shekinah that Doreen may know, and the Shekinah is the presence of God and is considered to be a female presence, not because the word she is in Shekinah. That's got nothing to do with it. But it's very, very integral with the idea of the Mother Spirit. And the Mother Spirit basically blessing the soul of anybody who wants to get to know God in a personal way. The Shekinah is the sometimes visible presence, but certainly the spiritual presence in somebody's life. So that was my connection with that.
Thank you. I offer the opportunity to the others of you to comment on this paragraph about the creative Mother Spirit. If anyone wishes to do so, please signify that. I do not see any volunteers urgently pressing for the opportunity to speak. And so as a consequence, I would ask Bob once again to place the document on the screen in front of us so that someone can read excerpt 3.
Okay, 1 second here. Screen 2.
George, would you do the honors, excerpt 3, please? You're muted at the moment. You don't see it. All right. Stephen, do you see it? Could you read it for us, please?
Yeah. While God the sevenfold is indispensable to the evolutionary attainment of the Supreme is also indispensable to the eventual emergence of the ultimate. And the dual presence of the Supreme and the ultimate constitutes the basic association of sub-absolute and derived deity, for they are interdependently complemental in the attainment of destiny. Together, they constitute the experiential bridge linking the beginnings and the completions of all creative growth in the master universe.
Thank you, Bob. You can release that now, if you would, please. So to me, the beginning of this paragraph is the connection that led me to believe that it was useful. God the sevenfold is indispensable to the evolutionary attainment of the Supreme. But in the remainder of the paragraph, the author, a mighty messenger, goes on to declare that the Supreme is indispensable to the eventual emergence of the ultimate. Now, we have trouble with understanding what the ultimate is as a reality and as a spiritual force. But it is interesting that this parallelism, in effect, creates the bridge that takes us from the finite experience that we have on this planet right into ultimate destiny, and likewise takes the universe that we live in, the material realm, from the level of finite reality to the level of ultimate reality. Bob, is this something that relates to you or that you wish to relate to?
Sure. The ultimate is essentially the 4 outer space levels, and that's the absonite domain. It's the middle ground between absolute and finite. Don't know exactly what it is. The reveltors used the word that these beings will eventuate, and they could have used any word that they want because we don't. It's not creative. They're not created. So I did discuss this concept one time with the late Dan Massey, and he went into some length about what he thought that these absonite beings that need to have the finite to be able to eventuate. We got into some discussion about all of that, but that's quite a very interesting place. We don't know a lot about it. We know the location. We know that it's the next universe age, and we know that the Supreme from this statement here is extremely important, and it needs to be the nucleus, as Havona is the nucleus for the grand universe. Over.
Thank you, Stephen.
I might have something to add that might be helpful. My understanding of the absonite and the ultimate is that there is growth, but not experience. It is not experiential growth. Now, that doesn't make sense to us necessarily, but that is talked about when they talk about the Supreme, that the Supreme grows through the accumulation of experience, but absonite beings grow in some other way that I think is probably beyond our comprehension. But I'll just throw that in.
I agree with you. I am likewise unable to explain this, but I'm in good company, I think, because none of us can. And the revelators were doing their best, but I must submit that the words they have used are effectively designations. As Bob said, they could have used any word, and they chose one. They chose the word eventuate. And it does not mean very much to us because we have no way in our own experience of relating to that word. George, is there anything in this paragraph about the relationship between God the sevenfold and then God the supreme and God the ultimate that attracts your attention, that makes you desire to comment?
Nothing more than to say it's beyond my understanding. I mean, I've spent some time trying to figure out the metaphysics and the seven absolutes of infinity, the Trinity, the triunities, the triodities, and then you get to God the ultimate and God the absolute, and I'm lost.
Well, George,
or the unnamed consummator of universe destiny.
aha.
I mean, I'm lost. I'm lost.
George, I think you're in excellent company because I believe that all of us share your frank confession that these concepts go beyond our level of understanding. And in the hope that perhaps our discussion of the God the Supreme that begins next week will enable us to explore some of these matters in greater depth. That is where I propose to begin. That is to say, on the second half of page 9, we've had an extremely interesting discussion today. I have to say, lady and gentlemen, there's only one lady, so I can't say ladies, but lady and gentlemen, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it greatly and look forward to seeing most, if not all of you next week.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Nice haircut, Doreen.
Thank you, sweetie.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.